The victory at Guadalcanal was decisive, but it came at a staggering cost. That battle defined the brutal parameters of the war to come. General Kawaguchi grimly observed that the Japanese army was not the only service buried in the graveyard of Guadalcanal. The immense cost in ships, aircraft, and human lives forced a new reality upon the Allies. They realized that systematically clearing every Japanese-held island was logistically and emotionally unsustainable. This new reality became immediately apparent in the New Georgia campaign. New Georgia was the crucial stepping stone toward neutralizing Rabaul. The advance to seize the Munda airfield was not a rapid thrust. It was a long, agonizing slog through a landscape designed to defeat men. The dense, jungle-covered terrain and the incessant rains turned paths into impassable morasses. American troops were pinned down by enemy artillery and mortars. Meanwhile, the Tokyo Express continued to feed thousands of Japanese reinforcements into the fray. The sheer physical and psychological burden of this fighting was immense. Supplies dwindled and exhaustion was universal. The men of the reinforced 43rd Division suffered acutely. They displayed high rates of psychoneurotic stress symptoms. This was a testament to the constant claustrophobic pressure of jungle combat. The enemy was rarely seen, but they were always present. For weeks, the troops pushed through swampy areas. They battled the environment as fiercely as they battled the entrenched Japanese. When the Munda airfield was finally captured on August 5, 1943, the victory was secured. It was a victory measured not in strategic genius, but in sheer, bloody attrition. The naval war fought in the narrow channels of the Solomons was equally unforgiving. The Japanese held a terrifying advantage in night combat. They relied on their superior long lance torpedoes. The waters around the central Solomons became a gauntlet of sudden, explosive violence. Yet this dominance was shattered in the early morning hours of August 6, 1943. This was the Battle of Vela Gulf. As the Japanese attempted to reinforce Kolombangara, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's American destroyers executed a textbook night attack. Using radar to achieve perfect position, the destroyers unleashed a devastating salvo of torpedoes.
The swift, coordinated strike annihilated the Japanese screening ships.
Vessels carrying over 900 Japanese soldiers were sunk, marking a decisive victory. It was a brutal reversal of fortune. It affirmed that American technological and tactical superiority could, at last, overcome the terror of the Japanese night fighter. The lesson learned in the New Georgia crucible was profound. The Allies could not afford to pay the price for Munda again. The strategic imperative shifted from conquest to containment. The focus moved from attrition to agility. Following the costly capture of the Munda airfield, Allied planners executed the strategic breakthrough they desperately needed. Instead of launching a frontal assault on the heavily fortified Kolombangara, they simply bypassed it. Such a move would have replicated the Munda nightmare. On August 15th, Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson oversaw the swift landing on Vela La Vela. This successful leapfrog maneuver isolated the 12,000 Japanese troops left behind on Kolombangara. They were left to wither on the vine, cut off from outside aid. The capture of Vela La Vela brought Allied air power decisively closer to Rabaul. This confirmed the wisdom of the new strategic approach. It set the stage for the final critical landing on Bougainville. The Allies were no longer fighting the enemy's war. They were forcing the Japanese onto the defensive. They were systematically dismantling the Japanese perimeter one bypassed fortress at a time. The strategic goal of neutralizing Rabaul required one final bold step. It demanded establishing Allied air power within the 200-mile striking range of the fortress. This imperative drove the decision to invade Bougainville, but first the skies had to be cleared. For weeks leading up to the invasion, Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58 and Air Souls waged a sustained campaign. General Kenny's 5th Air Force and General Twining's 13th Air Force devastated Japanese bases. Hundreds of bombers and fighters pounded Rabaul's airfields. They destroyed aircraft on the ground and killed trained flight crews in the air. By October 22nd, Kahili Airfield on Bougainville was non-operational. Balalile was unusable, cratered into oblivion. By November 1st, the Japanese air strength in the northern Solomons was crippled. It numbered only one-third of the Allied land-based planes now poised for the assault. The sea lanes were secured, but the enemy's intentions remained dangerously unclear. To confuse the Japanese high command and secure intermediate staging grounds, the Allies initiated two specialized operations. The first, in the Treasury Islands, commenced on October 27th. The landings on Mono and Stirling, involving the New Zealand 8th Brigade, were swift. Some critics later deemed the commitment of 7,500 men against an estimated garrison of 150 as overkill. Nevertheless, the operation secured vital supply bases. Crucially, it also secured a functioning radar station. This further cemented Allied air and naval superiority in the southern approaches. More dramatic was the Choiseul raid, code-named Blissful. Lieutenant Colonel Krulak led 656 Marines from the 2nd Parachute Battalion. They moved into a landscape that defied description. Choiseul was, in Krulak's words, the most rugged in the Solomons. It was a 75-mile-long spine of nearly impenetrable rainforest. The dense jungle canopy created a feeling of perpetual late afternoon. The raid, aided by nearly 100 native guides, was designed purely to confuse the Japanese about the true target. The Marines fought not only the enemy, but the environment itself. Trails turned to swamps under continual rain. The oppressive heat and humidity exhausted the troops. During the fierce engagement at Sangigai, a Japanese banzai charge was cut down by machine gun fire. Colonel Krulak and his company commander Spencer Pratt were both wounded. Yet the raid was a stunning success, achieving its primary objective of sowing chaos. The Japanese were convinced a major force had landed. They diverted a large bomber strike to Choiseul on November 1st, only to find nothing. The raid also yielded an intelligence coup. A captured chart detailed minefields around southern Bougainville. This information, immediately transmitted, proved critical for the imminent landings. The diversionary tactics peaked with a desperate evacuation near the Warrior River. A sinking landing craft, overloaded with exhausted Marines, was shielded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's PT-59. Despite having only 1/3 of its fuel, Kennedy used his boat to protect the floundering craft. He ultimately crammed 55 grateful Marines onto the small PT boat as it struggled back to base. With the skies clear and the enemy confused, the stage was set for the main event. This was the landing at Empress Augusta Bay. The decision to land at Cape Torokina, on the western coast, was a calculated risk. It was a lightly defended lodgment. It would allow the Allies to establish airfields without replicating the costly slogging battle for Munda. On November 1, 1943, the assault began. At 0645, transports anchored 3,000 yards offshore. H-hour was 0730. As the assault waves roared toward the beaches, destroyers laid down sustained fire. But the initial pre-landing naval bombardment, relied upon so heavily in previous operations, proved miserably inadequate. At Blue One Beach, the Marines hit a wall. Japanese engineers had meticulously fortified the area. They built 25 log and earthen pillboxes, camouflaged and integrated into interlocking fields of fire. One pillbox housed a 75mm field piece. It opened fire when landing craft were still 500 yards out. The landing waves dissolved into chaos. Sergeant McAllister, wounded but determined, recalled the carnage in his boat. Men lay bloody, some clinging to only half a rifle. Intense hand-to-hand combat erupted in the narrow trenches outside the pillboxes. It was here that Sergeant Robert Owens earned the 1st Congressional Medal of Honor for the 3rd Division. Demonstrating self-sacrificing heroism, he assaulted the 75mm gun emplacement. The immediate challenges ashore were twofold: the enemy and the environment. High surf caused landing craft to broach and discharge Marines into waist-deep water. Behind the narrow beach, the terrain rose sharply into an almost impassable swamp. Shore parties attempting to unload vital supplies faced a sticky, stinking mire. This turned the logistical effort into an exhausting nightmare. Bulldozers and heavy equipment sank immediately. Though the Japanese garrison near Cape Torokina was small, their defense was ferocious and the environment unforgiving. This immediately signaled that the fight for Bougainville would be a prolonged struggle. It was a fight against nature and a determined, entrenched foe. The beachhead was secured, but the isolation was stark, and the cost was beginning to mount. The tenuous beachhead established at Cape Torokina could not survive without absolute naval control. Just hours after the Marines clawed their way ashore, the Japanese launched their decisive counterstroke at sea. Admiral Omori's naval force, larger than the American screen, steamed toward Empress Augusta Bay. Their intent was to destroy the transports and isolate the invasion force. But in the black, chaotic waters of the Solomon's Night, the age of the Japanese night fighter was abruptly and violently ended. Admiral Merrill's Task Force 39 held the technological edge. It comprised 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, all equipped with reliable advanced radar. At 35,900 yards, the American screens detected the enemy long before the Japanese could sight them. This advantage allowed Merrill to coordinate his movements with deadly precision. As American destroyers launched initial torpedo attacks, the cruisers unleashed devastating broadsides. Though the Japanese fired their formidable long-lance torpedoes, their lack of radar-guided targeting rendered them mostly ineffective. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, fought in the early hours of November 2nd, was a decisive, if confused, victory. The Japanese light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers were sunk. Though the American task force sustained damage, the victory was critical. It prevented the isolation of the Bougainville lodgment. It signaled the definitive end of Japanese naval challenges in the Northern Solomons. Admiral Halsey, ever the aggressive gambler, seized the initiative. He knew that neutralizing Rabaul demanded the annihilation of the Japanese Second Fleet. Taking a calculated strategic risk, he ordered a week-long carrier strike against the massive Japanese base. On November 5th, Admiral Sherman's Task Force 38 launched nearly 100 planes against Blanche Bay. The strike was spearheaded by the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. The raid, lasting less than 30 minutes, was a crippling blow. Despite heavy flak and interception by 70 Japanese fighters, the American bombers inflicted significant damage. They struck Japanese heavy cruisers, including the Maya and Mogamai. A second, larger strike on November 11th cemented the victory, damaging the light cruiser Agano. The cumulative losses in aircraft and, more critically, trained flight crews were irretrievable for Japan. The neutralization of Rabaul was complete. This reduced subsequent Japanese airstrikes on the Bougainville beachhead to mere nuisance raids. It successfully prevented what would have been a catastrophic land invasion of New Britain. The Solomons campaign had been decided at sea and in the air. Meanwhile, on Bougainville, the war was fought for yards of mud and jungle. The Marines secured the beach and immediately pushed inland. They needed to secure the ground necessary for the vital airfields. They also needed to eliminate the possibility of Japanese artillery fire. This advance was met with immediate, fierce resistance, particularly along the key Piva and Numa trails. The Japanese commander, General Hyakutake, recognized the strategic importance of the high ground. He committed forces to establishing roadblocks and holding the critical road junction. The climax of this initial phase was the brutal engagement known as the Battle of the Piva Forks. The Japanese defenses consisted of multiple lines of resistance. These included about 20 meticulously constructed pillboxes. The fighting was a desperate, grinding infantry affair until the Allies brought their decisive advantage to bear. Artillery. On Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, the Americans unleashed a massive, concentrated artillery barrage. They fired 5,600 rounds into the Japanese positions. The barrage was devastating, transforming the jungle into a landscape of utter destruction. When the Marines moved forward, they advanced through a weird, stinking, ploughed-up jungle of shattered trees and butchered Japs. The successful assault secured the vital road junction. It negated the Japanese advance and paved the way for the critical airfield construction. The Battle of the Piva Forks, the most serious engagement for the 3rd Marine Division, demonstrated the immense human cost of overcoming entrenched positions. This cost was paid even with overwhelming firepower. The establishment of the perimeter was only half the battle. The other half was the struggle against the environment. The initial landings had been characterized by logistical chaos. There were disorganized supply dumps and inadequate infrastructure. The tropical climate combined with swampy ground and stagnant water led to widespread disease. The heat, the humidity, and 17 days of rain in the first 18 days crippled combat effectiveness. Malaria and debilitating diarrhea demanded a systematic, large-scale effort to conquer the environment. This imperative drove a massive engineering and logistical transformation. The campaign shifted from a precarious beachhead to a formidable fortress enclave. Sanitary combat units were deployed, clearing 61,000 linear yards of creeks. They drained 4 million square yards of swamp by year's end. Engineers, like the 117th Combat Engineer Battalion, spearheaded the effort. They used bulldozers and clamshells to clear jungle. They built 10-foot-deep drainage ditches. They constructed roads surfaced with volcanic sand. The construction of airfields was the ultimate objective. It was the ultimate triumph of American logistics. CB survey teams completed grading for the Cape Torokina airfield by D+3. This allowed an emergency landing by November 24th. The Piva Uncle bomber strip, 8,000 feet long, was officially opened on December 30th, 1943. The Piva Yoke fighter strip was operational by January 3rd, 1944. This systematic consolidation was formalized on December 15th, 1943. Responsibility for the island passed from the Marine-led IMAC to the Army's 14th Corps. This was under Major General Oscar Griswold. This command consolidation allowed for a more systematic approach to defense and infrastructure development. The arrival of the American Division with its first elements landing on Christmas Eve marked the relief of the exhausted Marine units. The perimeter was meticulously fortified with pillboxes, trenches, barbed wire, and mines. The coastal strip was transformed into an impregnable base. The American capacity to overcome environmental and logistical hurdles had turned Bougainville into a vital staging point. Any future Japanese counterattack was foredoomed to failure. The Americans had transformed Cape Torokina into an impregnable fortress, but the Japanese High Command, isolated and clinging to outdated intelligence, refused to accept defeat. General Harukichi Hayakutake faced intense pressure from his superiors. He committed to a final desperate gamble, Operation TA. He believed, critically and fatally, that the perimeter was defended by only a single exhausted American division. In reality, it was defended by the two heavily reinforced divisions of General Griswold's 14th Corps. The Japanese objective was simple: shatter the American line. They intended to seize the airfields that had neutralized Rabaul and reclaim the strategic initiative. The offensive was delayed and plagued by logistical nightmares. 90% of the assault troops were already suffering from malnutrition, malaria, and dysentery. The attack finally commenced on the morning of March 8, 1944. Japanese artillery dragged painstakingly into position on the high ground, delivered a spasmodic and poorly coordinated bombardment. That night, under a drenching rainfall, the main assault began. Japanese soldiers, screaming threats, clawed their way up the steep, muddy slopes of Hill 700. They attacked suicidally, penetrating the thin defenses of the 145th Regiment. The fighting was immediate and visceral. Japanese officers brandishing sabers cried "Chusuto" as they led wave after wave up the incline. They were met by the American defenders' defiant shouts of "Yaruzo." The attacks were strategically flawed. The Japanese consistently charged the same strong points from the same direction. This tactical error played directly into the American Division's hands. The Americans had meticulously organized their defenses in depth. They utilized anti-personnel mines, interlocking machine gun fire, and tanks. The sheer futility of the Japanese effort was brutally clear on the slopes of Hill 700. Deadly grazing fire cut down hundreds. Corpses were strewn in piles. In one sector, Japanese bodies formed a human stairway over the barbed wire. It was a testament to the staggering cost of their devotion to the frontal charge. General Griswold, recognizing the massing threat, approved a devastating response. On March 23rd, the Americans unleashed the $1 million barrage. It was the heaviest concentration of artillery yet seen in the Pacific War. Over 4,000 shells from Corps and American artillery units tore apart the jungle. They annihilated the assembled Japanese forces within their narrow salient. The attack was broken not by infantry prowess alone. It was broken by the systematic, overwhelming application of American industrial firepower. General Iwasa admitted defeat and pulled back from Hill 700 on March 13th. The 3-week offensive had cost the Japanese 6th Division an estimated 5,500 dead. This compared to only 263 American dead. The failure of Operation TA was a decisive strategic defeat. It was driven not by a simple last-ditch sense of Bushido. It was driven by critically faulty intelligence and the inability to comprehend the scale of American preparation. As the Japanese retreated into the starving interior, the American focus shifted. It shifted to aggressive patrolling and to an internal political experiment. This was the deployment of segregated black troops into combat roles, driven by political pressure, including that from Congressman Hamilton Fish. The U.S. Army reluctantly began utilizing units like the 93rd Division. Elements of the 24th Infantry had already arrived. They endured intense scrutiny from Washington. Washington was acutely aware of the watchful eyes of the black press. The 25th Regiment of the 93rd Division was introduced cautiously into the Bougainville meat grinder. Generals Griswold and Baitler initially integrated the black battalions with seasoned white units for training and patrolling. These troops quickly demonstrated their resilience. Private Wade Foggy earned the division's first Bronze Star. He earned it for single-handedly knocking out 3 enemy pillboxes during a hazardous crossing of the Laruma River. Yet, systemic racism and lack of adequate jungle training created a vulnerability. This vulnerability would have profound and lasting policy implications. It exploded on April 6, 1944, in the notorious Company K incident. Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 25th Regiment was tasked with establishing a trail block east of Hill 250. They encountered a small Japanese hospital area. Confusion erupted, followed by unauthorized and indiscriminate firing, exacerbated by friendly crossfire. The order to withdraw triggered panic. The company retreated in disarray, losing significant equipment. They suffered casualties that were widely believed to be self-inflicted. The incident resulted in the deaths of Lieutenant Oscar Davenport and 9 enlisted men, with 20 wounded. The aftermath was immediate and devastating to the prospects of black troops. General Griswold's subsequent report cited the 25th's limited jungle training. It also cited a perceived lack of initiative among junior black officers. This report, amplified by existing prejudices within the War Department, cemented a belief among senior officials. Officials, including Secretary Stimson, concluded that black units were ineffective without white leadership. This localized panic, Colonel Everett Yon later argued, was due to a lack of prior instruction and experienced accompaniment. Yet the incident was tragically misrepresented. General George Marshall would later assert that the 93rd Division wouldn't fight, couldn't get them out of the caves to fight. This sweeping negative assessment was rooted in a single chaotic skirmish. It ignored the bravery and effectiveness shown by other black units. It ensured that segregationist policies governing combat deployment for black Americans in the Pacific would remain tragically rigid. Even as the larger war shifted decisively toward the Marianas and the Philippines, this rigidity persisted. Bougainville, now a strategic backwater, continued to claim lives in constant skirmishes. But the greatest casualty of the spring of 1944 was the opportunity for the full and equitable integration of black soldiers into the Pacific theater. The withdrawal of the American 14th Corps in late 1944 marked the end of the strategic necessity on Bougainville. It did not, however, mark the end of the bloodshed. As General Douglas MacArthur turned his gaze toward the Philippines, the Australian command seized the opportunity to take over the forgotten front. General Sir Thomas Blamey, commander of the Australian Army, rejected the American strategy. He refused to allow the enemy to wither on the vine.
Blamey believed in actively seeking out and destroying the enemy. This philosophy was born of national pride and a desire to prove the combat effectiveness of Australian forces.
In mid-November, Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Savage assumed command of all island operations from General Griswold. The Australian Second Corps replaced the departing American units. This initiated a radical shift from containment to conquest. By December 1944, the bulk of the 37th Division had departed. General Savish's instructions for a 3-pronged offensive were clear. He ordered the systematic clearance and destruction of all remaining Japanese garrisons. They were to be driven into the narrow southern Buin enclave. The Australian phase of the campaign spanned the final 6 months of the war. It devolved into a prolonged, costly, and ultimately unnecessary struggle. The Japanese forces were spectral figures, cut off from all outside aid since the neutralization of Rabaul. They suffered from severe malnutrition, malaria, dysentery, and beriberi. Their morale, while severely degraded, remained bound by the doctrine of fighting to the last. Japanese commanders, like Lieutenant Colonel Kawano and General Kanda, continued to commit their starving troops to suicidal actions. They repeatedly launched costly banzai charges against well-prepared Australian positions. They often attacked the same strongpoints from the same direction. This tactical error guaranteed annihilation. The Australian infantry used their artillery, tanks, and aggressive patrolling to systematically wear down the isolated garrisons. They achieved this despite being short of heavy equipment. They constantly battled the environment, with incessant rains turning the ground into seas of mud. The climax of this final bloody phase arrived in early April 1945. General Kanda was desperate to break the Australian advance toward Boyne. He concentrated his remaining forces for a renewed offensive. The focus of this final push was Slater's Knoll, a seemingly insignificant rise commanding the approach to the Boyne Road. On April 5th, Lieutenant Colonel Kawano's estimated 2,400 troops launched their assault. It was a disaster. The Japanese charged the Australian wire, only to be cut down by coordinated machine gun and artillery fire. Between March 28th and April 5th, the Japanese suffered at least 620 confirmed dead. Perhaps 1,000 more were wounded. Japanese dead were piled in heaps in front of the wire. It formed a grotesque testament to the futility of the charge. Following this defeat, General Kanda finally abandoned defensive action. He concentrated his remaining 17,000 men in a defensive perimeter. They were confined to a 15 by 30 mile area in the south. The Australian advance continued, a slow, methodical grind through the fetid jungle. Engineers struggled to cut wider trails. They laid logs across low-lying swampy ground and bridged numerous creeks and rivers like the Hongarai and the Hari. Malaria and jungle rot afflicted the Australian infantrymen. They endured the same hardships of heat and humidity that had exhausted their American predecessors. The 11th Brigade, worn out by constant patrolling, saw many companies reduced to less than half strength. Yet they pressed on. Their objective was now purely the conquest of every last mile of the island. The final toll of this bloody and largely unnecessary campaign was staggering. Over 18,000 Japanese soldiers died during the 6 months of the Australian offensive. This reduced their total numbers from over 65,000 to just 21,000 by the war's end. Australian losses were also significant. They suffered 516 dead and 1,000